Hello, everybody. My name is Caitlin Wood, and I look forward to discussing a really interesting topic with you all today. It's a topic that's not only incredibly relevant to some of the class discussions that we've had over the past several weeks, especially in relation to the cyborg theory by Donna Haraway, as well as the article written by Deborah Lupton, but in addition to that, it's also personally relevant as well. And by that, I mean to say that the topic at hand has directly affected my own life. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. So first of all, the topic that I'll be focusing on for the duration of this presentation is digital apps. More specifically, popular apps that are designed for and often targeted directly at the mental health community. I believe that this subject is worthy of analysis and exploration because the mental health community constitutes a substantial part of the current population. According to the National Alliance on Mental Health, quote, approximately 1 in 5 adults will be diagnosed with a mental disorder during the course of their lives. So I think it's really important for people to understand what exactly these apps are for, what their purpose is, how effective they are, perhaps most importantly, whether they are actually helpful or harmful for this targeted demographic. And that's my goal here. Okay, so for a quick overview of my presentation. The digital story is broken up into 3 different sections, and the first section is definitely meatier than the second and third ones. In the first section, I'll provide a fairly traditional literature review, and I'll talk about the articles that I've found on this topic. The first part will be about the origins of the apps, then the benefits, the drawbacks, and then we'll finish with some conclusions and future areas of research on them. For the second section of the presentation, I'm going to talk about the steps that I took over the course of my research process because the instructions for this assignment mention, quote, that it's important to tell your, or in this case, my, journey into the research corpus of your topic. Address both the process and content. What did you learn about the scholars? What sources did you find most / least informative? And so these are the kind of the questions that I'm going to try to answer in my presentation, especially when I'm walking through the steps that I took in the presentation. So also the last thing I'll do is provide, quote, a structured outline of the coherent narrative / sequence of headers to be included in your final analytic paper. This was per the instructions for the assignment. Then the third section of my presentation, I'll offer some brief closing remarks and personal reflections, and then I will show my works cited page. Okay, let's begin with literature review. So first of all, mental health apps have only recently started to become a popular area of research. You'll notice that the majority of the sources included on my works cited page are from 2017 to the present, and only a few are predate that. This is not to say, however, that mental health apps did not exist prior to 2017. On the contrary, according to several scholarly peer-reviewed papers, including one from 2015, which was written by Simon Lee and Steve Flatt, the first mental health apps actually started to be developed as early as 2009. But this lack of initial research is concerning when you consider how prevalent and accessible the apps were then and continue to be now to the public. For instance, Lee and Flatt mentioned that, quote, in 2013, there were only 32 published articles regarding depression apps, compared with a total of 1,536 apps available for download. This finding of a high availability but low evidence base brings into question the scientific credibility, validity, and efficacy of the majority of electronic psychological interventions currently available to consumers, unquote. So clearly the number of apps available on the market, past and present, have consistently outnumbered the number of scholarly papers written on the subject or on specific apps. The graphic you see on the screen right now, it was taken directly from another one of the peer-reviewed sources I found. It shows just how much the industry for mental health apps boomed between 2016 and 2017, and I think this is a testament to how popular this type of technology has become within the past 3 years alone. Professor Hodges mentioned in one of the lecture videos, I think it was last week's, but it could have been this week's as well, that he would prefer for us to try to incorporate a healthy balance between audio and visual components for this presentation. So that's what I have tried to do here by including quite a few graphs and photographs, and I hope that these are helpful for everyone. But anyway, I think this graphic reaffirms and echoes nicely 2 quotes from a different peer-reviewed source that I found. This one from Baker et al., and this is from 2016. I think these passages nail home how much potential there is in this particular industry to really reach a wide audience. Because the first passage, as you can see, it talks about how 76% of users would be willing to use these kind of apps if they were free. And the second passage kind of talks about how average users will check their phones as often as 150 times a day, which reflects how smartphone apps can generate, reward, and maintain strong habits involving their use. Again, I really like these quotes since they hammer home just how wide an audience these apps can potentially reach. Another scholarly source that I found, this one by Firth et al., echoes these two quotes by Baker really well. I didn't include the passage I'm about to say on the screen, but I thought I would just read it because it also kind of sums up what Baker et al. Is saying, but it's actually a different source. So Firth et al. Writes, quote, "The clear therapeutic potential of these apps has triggered a wave of interest and investment from governments, technology companies, advocacy groups, and research groups internationally. But in the enthusiasm to realize the potential of apps for depression and other disorders, it has become difficult to separate actual efficacy from overzealous aspirational claims. With thousands of mental health apps readily available through Apple or Google marketplaces, finding a useful tool supported by robust evidence to manage one's disorder is clearly a challenge for a layperson." Unquote. This is precisely what I want to look at in this presentation, so I want to look really closely at the specific benefits and drawbacks of these apps, and I wanted to distinguish between the ideal picture painted of these apps from designers and manufacturers and arrive at a more realistic depiction and understanding of them. So let's begin with what's good about the apps rather than the bad. As you can see here, I took some screenshots on my phone showing the top results for if you type mental health apps into the App Store for Apple, and we'll come back to these in a moment. So one of the first benefits of mental health apps is that they're usually fairly inexpensive. A person by the name of Jessica Shelton, she was a writer for Psych.com, which is a really popular online website / resource on mental health topics. And she recently wrote last year about how one of the most positive characteristics of these types of apps is that a lot of them are free. Now, this is not to say that all of them are, of course, but the vast majority actually are. The one that I was recommended when I have generalized anxiety disorder, and I was recommended one when I was a freshman in college. It was called Headspace. That one was free, and if you type the phrase mental health apps into the App Store, which I did, I'll show you that graphic again in a second, but basically you'll notice that most of them are really cheap. So let's look at that graphic again. As you can see, most of them are free. Now, you might notice that if you look really closely, it says in-app purchases on some of them. So you know that they're not like completely free in some cases, but the point is that most of these apps are really inexpensive. And in fact, the most expensive one that I found when I was doing my research was just over $6 total. So that should give you an idea of how cheap these are. And you'll notice that I have a little red arrow here. That's just pointing to Headspace. It's the one that I mentioned that I was recommended when my psychiatrist recommended one for me. Okay, so the next benefit is actually kind of a byproduct of the first one, because with these apps being so inexpensive and frequently free, this allows for more people from all backgrounds of life to download and use them. Jerry Kennard, who writes for Health Central, which is a organization that deals exclusively with health and wellness matters, he recently wrote an article in which he included the very troubling statistic that, quote, "Only 41% of all adults in the U.S. with a mental health condition received mental health services in the past year," unquote. This is really bad enough on its own, but of course that it's even worse for minority groups and for people living in the lower class. So the number goes down if you're in a minority group. So any device or app that has the potential to reach a larger audience, especially an audience that otherwise would never receive psychological treatment in any form, is potentially useful in that regard. Another scholarly source that I looked at, Torres et al., mentions, quote, mental health apps have the potential to reach people who would otherwise not receive help by removing the barriers to treatment. This is pretty much what I consider to be one of the best benefits of mental health apps, just the wide accessibility of them, essentially. Okay, let's transition to the next benefit. The portability and immediacy of these apps, especially in cases of emergencies. So most mental health apps are designed for cell phones, especially smartphones. And as most of you are already well aware, cell phones can essentially be carried anywhere. They usually stay right in your person and they travel with you wherever you go. And this is really significant because it offers mentally ill users the opportunity to use the app whenever and wherever they need to. So let's say I go to a party and I suddenly experience a panic attack. I have anxiety. What's great about these apps is that I can pull my phone up, pull it up in 2 seconds, and the app will give me treatment that I need. So they're beneficial in that regard. Another source, the source that I mentioned earlier, Firth et al., he notes that this kind of immediate feedback could be really useful in preventing or at least lowering the number of yearly suicides, especially among teenagers for whom suicide is the second leading cause of death. The idea kind of is that having a tool on hand to help these teenagers or people through really extreme depressive episodes could possibly curtail suicidal impulses in the moment. It's important to note, though, that no research has actually been conducted to prove whether this is true one way or another. So that's still in the very early beginning stages to find that out. As for the final two benefits, they kind of go together, so I'm going to bring them both at the same time. Basically, the first one talks about how these apps, are recommended by many psychologists as a supplemental aid to therapy, and the other is they provide the medical industry an easy and low-cost way of fixing the current shortage on mental health clinicians. So, basically, what's about this is that what's really driving this industry above all else right now and making it so profitable is that access to mental health care remains really limited, as almost half of the world's population lives in countries where there's less than one psychiatrist per 100,000 people. I got that quote from Firth et al. To make it clear. Firth et al. Also explained, quote, number of psychiatrist job openings increased by more than 97% between 2010 and 2014, and more than 60% of all counties in the United States, including 80% of all rural counties, do not have a single psychiatrist, unquote. So because of these vast shortages around the country, the medical industry is really looking for any and all viable ways to turn these numbers around, because obviously no one wants people to be left untreated. And if one psychiatrist is forced to take on too many clients, this is not great either, because the quality of treatment is sure to suffer. So mental health apps are beneficial in this regard because it allows mental health providers to provide treatment to a larger audience without becoming overtaxed themselves. So a lot of providers are recommending these apps to clients, a point that Jessica Shelton of Psych.com makes on her own website. She explicitly writes, quote, health experts predict that these apps will play an important role in the future of mental health care by providing innovative solutions for the self-management of mental health disorders, unquote. I've included here two charts from the Firth article. Please excuse kind of the bad quality of the images. But the first image shows current shortages of psychiatrists by state, with California needing the most positions filled at the moment. Second chart shows a dramatic increase in job openings in the mental health field between 2012 and 2016, and these numbers have only gotten worse since then. So mental health apps are really attractive from the standpoint that they might reduce the number of people who aren't receiving any treatment whatsoever. Okay, let's move on to the downsides. I'm going to start with the first one that I consider to be the most problematic of them all. That is the fact there's no governmental oversight for this industry, and that there's really no testing on whether these are actually effective or not. It's kind of jarring when you realize that most of the mental health apps currently in the market have little to no testing done on them to determine whether they do what they say they do. Baker et al. Published a peer-reviewed article that explains, quote, there appears to be a lack of appreciation for experimental validation among mental health developers. And one study revealed, quote, There is a complete lack of experimental evidence for many of the hundreds of mental health apps available.